Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a very special green offering of Book Talks, a series of conversations with authors about their books, hosted collaboratively by Pittsburgh Theological Seminary's Center for Writing and Learning Support and the Barber Library. My name is Shan Overton, and I'm your host and the director of PTS's Center for Writing and Learning Support and the faculty mentor for the Doctor of Ministry in Creative Writing and Public Theology. Tonight, we welcome our guests, Andrea Lloyd and Andrea Nagy-Benson, whose new book, Letters from the Ecotone, Ecology, Theology, and Climate Change, invites readers into a dialogue between the two authors, who are friends and colleagues. In this series of letters, which were written during the pandemic, our guests explored the realities of climate change from two perspectives: ecological science and theological and pastoral concerns. The authors sought common ground, the place where science and religion come together in a unified vision for the flourishing of life on Earth. Bill McKibben says that these letters provide us a model of how real people talk about the Earth in its time of crisis, and also about Christianity. In this way, Letters from the Ecotone charts a journey that includes scientific insights and Christian wisdom about a topic and a reality that matters to us all. Before I introduce our guests further, I'd like to take a moment to offer some thank yous and to make a few housekeeping notes for our audience. First, I'd like to acknowledge and thank my colleagues, Michelle Spomer, the director of Barber Library, and Tisha Wu, our user services librarian. They have created a series of library guides, also known as LibGuides, for Book Talks. Look in the chat to see the LibGuide links so that you can make it to the library's website and check that out. There are also additional links in the chat where you can purchase Letters from the Ecotone. We're going to put those in the chat as well, more than once, so that you'll be able to grab that while we're here together tonight. Also, before we move on, I'd like to thank our communications department, Melissa Logan and Robin Menard, for helping us get the word out about this event. Also, a big, loud shout out to our IT department, including the fabulous Bobby Jarsulik, who is right here, right now, taking care of all the technology issues that might come up for us. Now, for a few more housekeeping notes, we are recording this event, a link for which will be posted on the PTS website for future viewing. Also, if you would like to ask our guests a question during the event, please type it in the Q&A or the chat at the bottom of your screen. I will be watching, as will my library colleagues, to be sure that your questions are voiced for our guests. Along the way, I will remind everybody to prepare your questions, so please join us for the conversation. We do want to hear your voices. One final note, there's a live transcription button at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to read along with us. And now to tell you a little bit about our guests. Reverend Dr. Andrea Lloyd currently serves in Castine, Maine, as pastor of the Trinitarian Congregational Parish in the United Church of Christ. She received her MDiv from Yale Divinity School in 2022 and was a facilitator for the Reimagining Church Project and a chaplain intern with the Veterans Affairs Medical Center while studying in New Haven. Prior to her Divinity School education, Andy was a professor in biology at Middlebury College in Vermont, where she also served as vice president for academic affairs and dean of the faculty. She holds a BA in geography from Dartmouth College, an MS in biology and wildlife from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Arizona. Welcome to you, Andy Lloyd. I'd also like to welcome Reverend Andrea Nagy-Benson, who is the senior pastor at the Congregational Church of Middlebury, a United Church of Christ congregation, where he also serves as affiliate chaplain at Middlebury College. Before arriving in Vermont, Andy was a senior pastor at Spring Glen Church in Hamden, Connecticut, and was a lecturer in homiletics at Yale Divinity School. He is a 1998 MDiv graduate of Yale Divinity School and holds a BA in English from Colby College. He is currently a Doctor of Ministry student here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in the Creative Writing and Public Theology program. And I am delighted, Andy and Andy Lloyd, that you both have joined us this month, so close to Earth Day, to discuss climate change at the intersection of science and theology. So welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. As we begin, I wanted to ask y'all to talk a little bit about the book's topic or focus, how you understand that, and the way that the book came into being, just to give our audience kind of an overview.
You want to start or you want me to start?
Why don't you start?
All right. So yeah, the topic of the book is climate change, and we're looking at it through the lenses of ecology and theology. And the book came about when we discovered that it was a topic near and dear to both of our hearts. I worked in my life as a biologist. I worked on the issue of climate change and its impacts on high latitude forests. So I had been studying climate change as a scientist and teaching about climate change for more than 20 years when I wandered into Andy's church one day, and life took a little bit of a turn at that point. And in one of our early conversations in which Andy was catching me up on some of the finer points of Christian theology, we came to realize that we shared an interest in the earth and in the fate of the earth and in environmental issues. And we started a conversation that hasn't stopped. It took us into the classroom at Middlebury College, and I'll let Andy finish the story.
Yeah, Andy and I were fortunate enough to teach together twice at Middlebury College, the second time being the spring semester of 2020. And I don't need to remind everyone what that semester was like. Our class quickly moved to Zoom, and we were sort of sequestered in our corners, not able to gather in person, of course. And I think it was in the summer of 2020, right, Andy, when we met for the first time in months to just sort of pick up the pieces of the semester, to see each other and just connect and catch up. And it was in the context of that conversation that I asked you a question, I think, about whether self-interest has a place in ecological science. And your answer in that moment was beautiful. And everyone who gets to listen to Andy Lloyd talk today will see what I mean. But what happened was she wrote a letter, like that was a fuller answer. She wrote this beautiful letter that when I got it, I couldn't believe it. I read it out loud to my family. There was like, this is beautiful. And I ended up writing her back. Not intending at that point to write a book, but just to keep connected and get that conversation going kind of again after it had been stalled out a bit. And one letter followed another letter for the course of that kind of an academic year. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a common interest. And that letter, I mean, I think in many ways, the topics in this book were topics that many of which anyway, we explored with our students. And they were just a great inspiration to me, I know, and I think to Andy too. Many of whom aren't all that conversant with Christian theology, maybe more conversant with ecological science, but I think we complicated a lot of their assumptions about how ecology and theology really they don't have to be mad at each other. It's not a competition. They both have a lot of wisdom. And when linked, they can be quite a potent combination. So, yeah, that's kind of where it started.
Mm-hmm. I have to admit, I found myself wishing I could have been in your class because, I mean, I could tell you were drawing some resources from the things you'd had students read and talk about in class. And it made me, you've got a good bibliography and everything in the book. So, I kind of can take your class in a sense. But it definitely felt like, wow, what an opportunity to get to sit with both of y'all and actually have that conversation with a larger group. and as well as hear you all have the conversation between the two of you.
Thank you.
I normally would follow up with a bunch of questions right now because I got a bunch already, but we agreed that you all would take about 20 minutes and read one letter each, so that the audience can hear kind of what this book sounds like and what it sounded like to you all as you got these letters in the mail from each other during the pandemic, or the lockdown part of the pandemic, I want to say, because the timeline on that is not over yet. But anyway, and I'm going to disappear and let you all have the floor entirely. But I also want to encourage our audience to think of questions that come up for you as you listen to these two letters, and to put those in the chat or in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, so that you all can participate in this conversation too, because I would really love to be able to voice some of your questions as well as my own. I mean, I've got plenty of them, but I'd love to hear what yours are. So Andy and Andy, take it away. Can't wait to hear your own voices.
Thank you. Andy's going to read first.
So I'm going to read the third letter that I wrote. So we're parachuting you into a conversation, and you'll hear in the letter some references to the previous letter, but you should be able to follow along. September 13th, 2020. Dear Andy, happy Welcome Sunday to you. I was thinking about last year's Welcome Sunday while driving to Heinsberg this morning. My heart ached more than a little bit thinking about the simple loveliness of that day. The whole beloved church, sitting at tables, sprawled on the grass, eating and passing the time. But then I thought about you and the kids and an ice cream truck gathering behind the church this afternoon, and that made me glad. I hope the Nagy-Bensons are adjusting to being a trio. We're on the cusp of going down to a duo again. So yeah, the image of Rachel sitting on the front steps singing Crowded Table is echoing around my heart. I'm right there with her. Galen just left for his dad's house. From there, he's moving into my friend Heidi's house. She's returning to British Columbia until the spring semester at least and wants a caretaker. He's going to buy their old VW too. Perfect setup for a 21-year-old. He's been busy reassuring me that his delight at the prospect of moving out and having his own transportation isn't personal. I've been assuring him that launching his own life is exactly what he should be doing, exactly what I want him to be doing, and I'll miss him. Both are true. So is this. I was really happy to get your letter. It's one to savor. My ears perked up, especially with your description of the capaciousness of the Pauline neighborhood. The whole world matters. That's music to this ecologist's ears. We don't get to pick and choose what we care about. Yes, yes, yes. I love that we arrived at that same point along different paths. And like you, I'm deeply worried about this neighborhood of ours. The West Coast is on fire. The Arctic's thawing and on fire. The oceans are rising. There are more hurricanes this year than there are names. And those are just this week's headlines. I find myself reading them with disbelief, even though I can't tell you how many grant proposals and papers I wrote over the years that started with a litany just like that. Here are the things that are likely to happen if current trends continue, I'd write. God have mercy. Now that it's happening, I have the unsettling feeling that I never fully processed what I was saying in the dry language of academic science. Knowing what I know, knowing what I have known for years and years, I shouldn't feel surprised at what I'm reading in the news. But I do. Day in and day out, I lived in the shadow of a future that is now upon us. So why am I surprised that it's here? I think I coped by keeping it all at arm's length. I wrote that litany over and over again. I understood exactly what it meant, but I couldn't let myself feel the grief it contained. I feel it now. Of course I feel it. I became a scientist because I loved this world. I don't remember a time in my life when I wasn't head over heels in love with this world. And the world with which I am in love is suffering. Grief is to be expected. Somehow the grief too catches me by surprise. So your question is also mine. What are we to do? My efforts at an answer start with a story. I had a colleague named Matthew Sturm. He's a geophysicist who studies snow. He's also a brilliant storyteller. He and I were in a meeting together along with a bunch of other scientists who studied Arctic climate change. We were trying to articulate in plain language what we collectively knew to be true about climate change in the Arctic. Somewhere along the way, though, we got stuck in the thicket of what we didn't know. To get us unstuck, Matthew told us a very simple story. It went something like this. Imagine the Earth system as a boulder resting on the top of a mountain. We know that we're pushing on that boulder, and we know that it's starting to roll. We don't know exactly where it will stop. That's true. But you're forgetting, he told us, that we know one thing beyond a shadow of a doubt. We know that the boulder is going to end up somewhere different than where it started. That was enough to get us unstuck. We didn't know the future with perfect clarity, but we did know that it would be different. We knew that the boulder was rolling. We knew that we needed people to pay attention to that fact. I'm thinking of that boulder as I think about the question of what we should do. The answer is everything. We should do everything we can possibly do, and probably some things that we think we can't. We need to throw every damn thing we've got in the path of that boulder. Every damn thing. Because here's the other truth illuminated by Matthew's story of the boulder, the one that ultimately became the story of the paper that came out of that meeting. A boulder rolling downhill doesn't just change position, it accelerates. Things are going to change faster and faster and faster. The longer we wait, the farther that boulder will be from where it started, and the harder it will be to stop. The why of that is a consequence of the interdependence of this neighborhood of ours. That interdependence means that ecological systems are full of feedback loops. A change in one thing causes a change in another, which causes a change in the original thing. Negative feedbacks stabilize a system by counteracting the initial change. Our bodies are regulated by negative feedback loops. Body temperature rises, we sweat, evaporative cooling happens, body temperature falls back to normal, and stability is maintained. Positive feedbacks amplify the original change. They're destabilizing. Not surprisingly, they're uncommon in physiology. Childbirth is apparently one of the few examples of a positive feedback loop in human physiology. Both kinds of feedback loops occur in ecosystems. The crucial question is, which kind will be more powerful as climate changes? Will negative feedback loops prevail, in which case Earth will stabilize itself, at least in part, and help save us from ourselves? Or will positive feedback loops prevail, in which case the response of ecosystems to anthropogenic changes will accelerate the rate of change? Nobody knows for sure. At the moment, the positive feedback loops seem to be winning. The Arctic Ocean is becoming ice-free, which exposes dark ocean water, which absorbs more sunlight, which warms the ocean, which in turn warms the rest of the Arctic. Positive feedback loop. The frozen Arctic soil warms and thaws, and long frozen organic matter starts to decompose, releasing carbon dioxide. Positive feedback loop. The Arctic burns and long buried carbon is released into the atmosphere. Positive feedback loop. Fire frequency increases and more forests burn every year, releasing carbon dioxide. Positive feedback loop. The cold Arctic tundra becomes hospitable to trees, which move north, and the white winter landscape of the Arctic is suddenly covered with dark coniferous trees that protrude above the snow and absorb sunlight and warm the surface. Positive feedback loop. I could go on, but you get the point. There are negative feedback loops. In some places, warming temperatures will make plants grow faster. That means more carbon dioxide taken from the air and turned into wood and biomass. On the scale of the whole Earth, especially if we include the oceans, that could make a measurable difference. Plants may yet help to heal the damage done. They may, but evidence that they will is shaky at best. Right now, the positive feedback loops are prevailing, the boulders accelerating. Before you start to regret opening this letter, am I too late? There's one more piece of the puzzle. There's another negative feedback loop. It's us, or it could be us. Unlike the Arctic Ocean or permafrost, we get to choose how we want to be. So here's what it could look like. The world starts to burn, thaw, flood, and blow away. If we're paying attention, we'll notice that. And here's where your letter is calling to me loudly. We aren't just thinking creatures, we're feeling creatures. We're a hot mess as a species, but we've got big hearts. We're made to love each other, made for those crowded tables. And so it's possible, isn't it, that when we notice what's happening to the world, we will feel loss. We will remember that we actually love this neighborhood of ours. In the name of love, we will change our ways. I'm pretty sure you preached that early in the pandemic, in fact. A love-motored negative feedback loop. For love, we change our ways and the boulder slows. It's a good story. I don't think it's impossible. I mean, think about it. We know how to do everything we need to do. It's not like, say, a pandemic caused by a virus for which there is no vaccine yet. We have the technological know-how to live differently. We just need the will. That's a big just, I get that. But I think that's where the neighborhood metaphor offers us something powerful. Your question, what to do and what not to do, is pretty straightforward ecologically. Ecology is really clear on the fact that limits exist. Whether we want them to or not, they do. And whether we want to or not, we live within them. So we do live within our means, and we do not live beyond our means and into the means of other people and species. We reject the fantasy that we can have whatever we want. We, especially the we that has monopolized more than its fair share of resources, give stuff up. We consume less, a lot less. We travel less. We eat more plants. We farm differently. We teach our children differently. And we change systems. We vote for leaders who will enact the systemic change we need to make it possible for us to live lightly enough on the earth. The Green New Deal is a great start. Live within our means. It's easy conceptually. But where I get stuck as an ecologist is in the awareness that it's a really hard sell. I'm no marketing expert, but I'm pretty sure that just say no to the luxuries you've come to love is not a message likely to rally people to the cause. But here's where the round table is so important. Your letter, which I've read and reread almost a dozen times over the last 24 hours, is a roadmap forward. I can tell this story as an ecological story about limits and no and giving stuff up. And it is all of those things, and we need to say those things out loud. The story you're telling in your letter also includes those limits, which is really cool. But the story you're telling is not mostly about don't and shall not. It passes through there, but it doesn't stop there. Your story is about love. If the past 6 months have taught us anything, they've taught us that in the name of love, we can do things we didn't think possible. We can give up things we didn't think we could live without. Sure, there are some holdouts. Not everyone is sold on the whole idea of loving our neighbors, but most people are. So that list, a couple of paragraphs up of what we have to do to save this world, don't you think it's possible that people would do that for love? I think we know in our heart of hearts that the way we're living isn't working for us. I think our big-hearted selves yearn for something different. I really do. I don't quite know what comes next. I feel like I'm seeing this path one flagstone at a time, one letter at a time, maybe. But here we are at this place that feels so full of possibility. Ecology and theology are both holding up big neon signs, neighborhood this way. And if we're all willing to walk there together, I think that we can heal this place we love. We can heal each other. I don't know how we will get there exactly, but I know it's where I want to go. This all has me thinking about your Ecotone poem. I'm thinking about the miracle that the light comes. And even more than that, I'm thinking about the miracle that when the light goes and darkness falls, we are capable of imagining the light. We're capable of holding fast to the hope that it will come again. And I believe it will. Peace, my friend. Andy.
Thanks, Andy. September 23rd, 2020. Dear Andy, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, The wrecking ball of 2020 keeps swinging, doesn't it? And yet, according to a Jewish teaching, someone who dies on or just before Rosh Hashanah is a tzaddik, a person of great righteousness. Justice Ginsburg died as the sun was setting last Friday evening. Ruth the tzaddik worked nobly for all persons under the law, and along the way taught many men what all means. She was a reckoner. She weighed truths. Also, she loved the opera. May her memory be a blessing. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing has me thinking about the space between how things are and how things ought to be, what Parker J. Palmer calls the tragic gap. As I hold this tension and read your letter and its postscript, I really, really want to speed ahead toward the hoped-for beloved community, to the neighborhood where life-giving oughts are realized. But I can't do that yet. First, I need to heed one of the lessons I've learned in church. Right relationships with God, neighbor, and all creation require the courage to name what isn't right. And what I need to say, whether I want to or not, is that we are slowly, and ever less slowly, making it impossible for living things to live here. That isn't right. That's sin. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says with near certainty that anthropogenic climate change is the result of human activity. This sounds to me like an occasion to pray. Most merciful God, we confess that we have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed, by what we have done and by what we have left undone. In the Gospel of Matthew, the first followers of Christ are called to love God and to love their neighbors as themselves, and to do to others as they would have others do to them. But they, like us, missed the mark. The number of yearly climate-related disasters has tripled since the 1990s. Last month's litany of lament echoed across the land. California wildfires, the derecho that did damage in South Dakota and Ohio, the Atlantic hurricanes. Lives and livelihoods were lost at summer's end because the planet is reeling. Same thing happened last year, and the year before that, and the year before that. Positive feedback loops prevailing on Earth. If this were a headline, it would sound better than it should to a distracted ear. The truth it tells, like the story you tell, is dire. Climate change is a rogue boulder accelerating downhill, threatening humankind. And most of us helped push it over the crest of the knoll. God have mercy indeed. So your letter and postscript make me wonder why. Why aren't human beings doing everything we can to slow the boulder? Why aren't I? Why have the current trends continued, decade after decade? On restless nights lately, I've been drifting down and up these paths, looking for clues. Maybe some of us don't know how not right things are. Maybe some of us do know, at least enough to know better, but we can't deal, or we're dealing with other stuff, like teaching our kid to drive or figuring out what to make for dinner for the zillionth time. Maybe some of us have a favorite uncle who calls bullshit on global warming every time it snows. Maybe some of us believe that God will pluck us out of the burning house. Maybe some of us believe that we will be saved by technological advances. Maybe some of us are so in love with this world that we have to look away, because the heart can only take so much ache. Maybe some of us are scared witless and don't know what to do. Maybe some of us are profiting like crazy and pouring gas on the fire and planning to retire early beside a rising ocean. Maybe some of us don't want to give up what makes us happy or our place at the center of the universe. maybe some of us, especially the billion of us scraping by on $1 a day, are just trying to survive. Maybe some of us don't want anyone telling us what to do. Maybe some of us are waiting for someone to tell us what to do. Maybe some of us would care more if we knew our neighbors better. It's hard to love what you don't know. In any case, after another fitful sleep and Green Mountain sunrise, climate change is still real. It's time to do everything we can to slow that boulder down. The why of that is very clear. If we do not change our daily ways, and if the oil and gas sector keeps reeling in profits of 11 billion a year, and if we keep electing people who have an apparent allergy to caring for the well-being of our planet, human civilization will not survive the positive feedback loops of our making. I think that's why I'm praying more these days. Not because I think prayer alone will stop climate change, not because I think God will do the work that is ours to do. God does not do the dishes we leave in the sink. I think I'm praying more because that is something I can do. Mostly I pray because I need God's help, and I want to be helpful for God's sake. I pray because that's when, if I can stop all the chatter in me, I hear the faint assurance of God with us and remember God's delight in the diversity and breathtaking beauty of this world. I pray to speak my heart and to listen for wisdom. I pray to be honest to God, like I'm scared to live in Trump's hellscape, like I'm heartsick for my kids' future on this planet, let alone the future of their kids. I pray because I know my need for mercy and grace, and I trust that God wants to give us a garland instead of ashes. Speaking of prayer, do you remember sharing Walter Rauschenbusch's gem with our class last year, the prayer called "For This World"? It bears repeating. Oh God, enlarge within us the sense of fellowship with all the living things, our little brothers, to whom thou hast given this earth as their home in common with us. We remember with shame that in the past we have exercised the high dominion of man with ruthless cruelty, so that the voice of the earth, which should have gone up to thee in song, has been a groan of travail. May we realize that they live not for us alone, but for themselves and for thee, and that they love the sweetness of life even as we, and serve thee in their place better than we in ours. When our use of this world is over and we make room for others, may we not leave anything ravished by our greed or spoiled by our ignorance. But may we hand on our common heritage fairer and sweeter through our use of it, undiminished in fertility and joy, so that our bodies may return in peace to the great mother who nourished them, and our spirits may round the circle of a perfect life in thee. This reminds me, I still want to reach that beloved community, that neighborhood where life-giving oughts are realized. And like you, I still believe that if we're all willing, we can heal this place with God's help. Blessings on you, my friend. Peace, Andy.
Wow, y'all. That is so beautiful to hear it out loud. Thank you so much for reading that to us and to each other. It's really great to also get to watch your reactions to each other's work. It was lovely. I didn't have this as one of my questions, but I just really wanted to say I hadn't ever encountered this Rauschenbusch prayer, but I wonder how did your students respond to it in the class? Because you used this with them, and so I'm curious what they thought of it.
I think that was one of the earliest classes that we had that in the winter term, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they didn't know what to make of me. I think there's like a low grade allergy to all things religious on campus. So it was, I don't know, I was maybe just like a circus act, but I those words are beautiful. And I think it surprised some of them to hear a voice from the church of past, over 100 years ago, saying things that we're saying right now and are writing about now and praying now. And of course, there were certainly a few students, actually one of whom was in my youth group, so I know she went to church, who probably wasn't super surprised that A, I would read that prayer in class, and B, that there is such a prayer, and there are many. And I think the reaction was maybe on the quieter side, but that probably had to do with it being the first or second class of the semester. But there was no one ran out of the room, and I think people ultimately found great delight. Honestly, we'd have these fishbowl sessions, Shan, where Andy and I would sit in the middle of this room and be circled with chairs of students, and we would just have a conversation, much like our letters. And they would listen in, and then they could jump in with questions and such. And I think they loved that as much as we did, because I don't know, it was maybe an antidote to the talking heads that are shouting at each other on the news all the time about things. And we were just having a conversation, and there are places where things part ways, but there was a lot of common ground. And I think that prayer was one inroad into that kind of rich terrain.
Mm-hmm. Andy, did you want to add anything to that, or is that?
That was a very nice answer. The only thing I would add is that I think I at least was surprised by what the students were carrying into class in terms of their expectations, not just that religion and ecology didn't have anything to say to each other, but they actually expected personal antipathy between the two of us. Like, part of their reaction was like, they're not yelling at each other. They actually seem to like each other. And so, like, there were these multiple moments and Rauschenbusch's prayer was one of them. And then our ability to be civil with one another was another, where you could just see the sort of little heads exploding all around the classroom in the best possible way.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, I was going to ask y'all about this, dichotomy of science and religion, and which seems to me to be part of the reason we're in the shape we're in now, right? Because we've like segregated these things off into their silos, and so you can't work collaboratively across the boundaries that shall not be crossed. And so that's an intellectual boundary, but it's also a practical boundary in terms of how we do our work. And it seemed to me, I mean, you all use this word ecotone, and it seems like the place you all are sitting is in the ecotone between these two fields that have been sort of seen as separate, communities or ecologies in a way. And I wanted to explore that a little bit more with you, because you've been teaching that and modeling it both in the way that you write the letters, but also like your description about the students listening to you. And I wonder, what have you learned about healing the rift? I mean, as you have gone into not only the writing, but talked to audiences about this, gotten responses, and about the connection of the work you're doing to do the repair and restoration of the larger ecological neighborhood, that we live in.
That's a great question.
Can I start, Andy, and then you can jump in, because I will forget this.
Well, you're excited to say something.
I am excited because, do you remember also in that class, we showed them a piece of writing from Jonathan Edwards, and we showed them a piece of writing from, was it John Muir? I can't remember now.
Yep.
And we didn't put the names on top, and we put the essays in front of them, and we had them guess which was which, because this one essay from Edwards was about spiders. The guy was brilliant, of course, and he knew as much as any biological scientist about spiders. He studied them like with exquisite detail. And this essay was about spiders. So most of the kids were like, well, I guess this is the ecologist. And Muir was waxing spiritual and religious actually too in some of his language around this beautiful scenic area in California. And I think what that taught them, and I think it taught me in experiencing their experience of that, was the necessity to listen to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's it's not like an iron solid fence. It's more porous than that. The relationship between ecology and Christian theology are far more porous historically than they have been in the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. But there was a little bit of a breakup. And I think that rift that you're referring to is there. But I think we tried to model, and I think they did too, in what they were sharing in small groups. I think there was an ability to talk with one another and listen for some truth or some insight that they wouldn't have gained only within their own circle of study. So I think and that's a willingness, obviously. That's a vulnerability and an openness to learn across the lines. And that's all.
And I agree with all of that. And I would add that one of the things that we got interested in both in the course of teaching, this actually started in class, but then it became an important part of our letters, was thinking about what's the language we can use to build those bridges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are the bridge words? And that's where the idea of the ecotone came from, was this recognition that there are concepts, and it started with the common good. There are concepts that have resonance in both ecology and theology. And so we started thinking about the language that can help us to build those bridges and help us to build connections between these disciplines. I mean, and I think Andy's exactly right, that at the end of the day, it's a willingness to listen generously to each other. And like, that's partly about individual relationships and being willing to get into relationship with somebody who comes from a different disciplinary background. There are also structural things. I mean, the academy is set up to reinforce the notion that our disciplines are different from each other because resources are allocated according to departments there's reasons why we don't talk to each other. And I think what's really fascinating to me in this moment is that some of those structural barriers, I think, are starting to come down. I know a lot of scientists who are really interested in reaching out to faith communities and to scholars of religion, because I think the magnitude of this problem is such that we've all come to understand that none of us can solve it alone. Yeah. And so there's an appetite there to listen and to find the bridge words and to find the bridge language and to stop just protecting our own little piece of the pie and collaborate.
And, this is so interesting because, of course, I'm a writer and I teach writing and I'm really focused on this stuff. And so I was watching y'all's conversation about the language and storytelling and all of that, all the way through the letters. And I wanted to ask you, because one of the bridge words that you all end up with, I think, and maybe you would call me wrong on this, but I felt like the notion of neighborhood and like massaging, exploring that word, so that it has valences both within the ecological sciences, but also theologically. And I wanted to ask you all to talk about that from both vantage points, because that one to me felt really interesting. As a possibility for something that we could all perhaps work on together, or use together somehow.
Yeah, that was a really cool moment and I think Andy started it in the letter just before the one I read, by raising the idea of neighborhoods, and it kept coming up. And what I love about it as an ecologist is that it's not even remotely a stretch to argue that neighborhood is an ecological concept. It's something I used to teach this in introductory ecology. Like, you can calculate things about ecological neighborhoods. And it has a similar consequence in ecology as in theology. So it's one of those beautiful words that we all understand. B, it's a scale. It feels like a scale at which you don't think, oh, that's too big. And C, it actually works both theologically and ecologically without needing a whole lot of translation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, whether we're talking about the Pauline letters or love your neighbor as yourself, I mean, there's Christian theology is I think it would maybe not centered on, but close to centered on that love of neighbor, and which implies neighborhood.
Mhm.
If your neighbor can be anybody, sure, so across the world, but everyone, yeah, I mean, in Christian theology, that's sort of low hanging fruit. So it was sort of fun when
Mhm.
we weren't able to hang out much during the writing of these letters. That's which made getting the letters in the mail so much of a joy. But I think we would talk occasionally on the phone, and when we struck those, like, what did you call them, like the footbridge planks, between the two disciplines. I think surely, Shan, you put your finger right on one of the key ones, was that this concept of neighbor and neighborhood, which has a real richness to it in both disciplines. And you're right, we were trying to bring those disciplines right next to each other, and where they meet is the ecotone, and neighborhood was certainly one of the kind of the marquee concepts that kind of is woven through the letters.
Mhm.
Well, and I'm discovering now now that I'm stepping into a pulpit every week, and the ecologist in me keeps showing up with weird analogies and metaphors. But I've find myself using the language of neighbor to talk about the non-human species with whom we share the earth. And it's a really powerful way to talk about our obligation to other species. And it's one that's easy to grasp.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
Yeah, you've helped me understand that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I've got audience questions I need to ask, pose to you, but I just want to also say that, like, the way that you all talked about that made me expand my notion of what a neighbor is to include, soil and the fungus that lives among us with the trees, and all of, the birds. I mean, I already probably felt that way about birds. So it's pretty easy for me, but I mean, in a lot of ways to think about neighbor, and also think about neighbor as the pond down the street, or, and what that means when you say love your neighbor as yourself. It's interesting to start playing with that, both theologically and then also what little I know about science, to think about how that sort of opens up some possibilities. I want to jump to a question from, actually, Bobby Jarsulik has asked in the chat, what's a negative feedback loop that you two discovered that surprised you with its impact or creativity from scripture, daily life, or elsewhere? How can we sustain that loop and live into it further as we attempt to grow from the lessons of the last few years? Thanks, Bobby, for that great question.
That's a great question. And the answer that comes to mind is a positive feedback loop. So I'm going to share that. I'll see if I can think of a negative one, but one of the, this was somewhere in the middle. One of my letters, I was talking about the work of a mentor of mine, Terry Chapin, who does really interesting work on stewardship and on earth stewardship and on the ways that individual responsibility can make a difference. And that led me down this rabbit hole that ended up in a paper about it was a study of the adoption of green technology in Papua New Guinea. But then the upshot of it was that there's this accelerating effect of neighborhoods and of people wanting to do what their neighbors do. So if one person puts up solar panels, suddenly everybody else is putting up solar panels, maybe not because they care so much about climate change, but they're interested in what their neighbor does, or their neighbor has talked to them. And it's this really interesting amplifying effect. It's a positive feedback loop driven by our attachment to and trust for and desire to be like our neighbors. And I'm fascinated by that. And that's a way that small changes get amplified, and we can have a positive feedback loop for the good. That's what came to mind for me. I'm curious what Andy's answer is, though.
I do remember when that Papua New Guinea letter came. That was
It's a beauty.
Yeah, that was a beauty. Yeah, I don't. I mean, I would defer to Andy on the negative feedback loops ecologically. If we can sort of jump into the theological realm with that phrase in mind, I think one of the negative feedback loops that I sort of experienced in my own reading and listening during this year of letters was learning a lot more about the young evangelical climate action crew, which is the largest young people's coalition that I'm aware of, at least in the Christian ranks. And there's, I guess I will just be honest and say that I'm a progressive pastor, and I often don't feel a real kinship with a lot of the evangelical theology. And yet there's this group that is really powerful, swaying some big steeple evangelical pastors toward the green. And that is helpful. That's helpful. I mean, in terms of like, if negative feedback loops are what's going to help us get to where we need to go, that for me was helpful to know that I have to check my own assumptions, A, and B, I'm really glad that people are using whatever leverage they have to sway a group of folks' opinions on this issue, and they're doing tremendous work. You can look them up. They're in the mix. They are lobbying. They're senators, and I mean, they're getting into it way more so than any group that I'm aware of in my own denomination. So I just want to say that was an example of one thing over the time, but yeah.
And I also see one person, Ruth Bowling, has answered in the chat on y'all's behalf that your book is a negative feedback loop, which is, I mean, that's a really great insight. Thank you for sharing that, Ruth.
Thank you, Ruth.
We have another question from an anonymous attendee. And actually, before I answer that, let me say we've had a request to post the words of the prayer so that one of our attendees can have a copy. And I've said that the prayer is in the book. But also my bet would be if you put Rauschenbusch and then the name of the prayer is For This World from 1910 or so. And he says, you might find it in Google, but also we'll see if we can locate it somewhere.
There's actually, if you do Google that, you're right, Shan, and not only will you find that prayer, but you'll find the entire collection of Rauschenbusch's prayers, which are now in public domain.
Okay.
And I have spent many hours within them, and they are free and accessible to everybody who has internet.
Thank you so much for that. Now a question from an anonymous attendee. Could you elaborate further on how our current relationship with the earth is sinful? Not an easy one, but go for it.
Yeah, I did say that. I guess I should start. Well, I think let's think about love. Like love, at the very least, means do no harm. And I think if we ask ourselves, or ask myself, anyone asking oneself, is the way that I'm living my life day to day, the decisions that I'm making about everything, the food I eat and my transportation, am I doing harm? And I think, our friendship has been a blessing, and among the blessings is learning a lot more about ecological science. And it's clear to me that any lifestyle or any decision action that's going to potentially harm people directly or indirectly is in the category of not so good, and what misses the mark. And I use sin, on purpose in that letter, because I think that, and I actually remember saying that to the class, and they were kind of like, whoa, but just to frame climate change as, at least in part, human sin isn't a huge stretch. If we think about humans being the engine that's driving the warming climate, that's not I don't think that's a bridge too far, but there's clearly a lot more to say about it. And in the book, there are many examples of human behavior that is part of the problem. And I think I own that. And I think to some extent, a lot of people I do own that. And unfortunately, most of the folks in the world, and this is in other letters, but that we didn't read today, but we're really mindful of the fact that climate change is impacting a huge number of people who did the least to contribute to the problem. And I think there's a justice issue tied in with that as well. So there's so many interconnecting lines, but that's true. And I think that's a problem and doesn't seem to line up very well with the Christ that I follow.
Yeah.
We have thank you for that. We have a question from Charles, somebody I know, who I'm not 100% sure what Charles is asking, but I'm going to try to interpret it. He says, Tom Colvin wrote the hymn, Christ the Lord is risen. One line reads, sin has done its worst, referring to the killing of Jesus as God or deicide. And then he says, I hope ecological issues do not get to the worst. I'm not exactly sure I understand this. If so, I wonder what resurrection looks like after the ecological worst. Beyond grief, legislation, and driving a hybrid, how do I shake the sense of ecological futility, I guess, in order to keep the worst from coming? How can God ordain the ecological vocation with a global authority? The global government meetings are not working. Although in your book, you all do talk about some larger scale things that are going on and collaboratively that actually are having impacts. And really, this gets to a question that I had, which is, the problem's so big. We're so small. You use David and Goliath from 1 Samuel as a frame for this that sort of threads its way throughout the book. And I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I'd love for you all to talk about this. Like, how do we address this? How do we, try to do some good when it seems like it's me just throwing a little stone at like this, not even Goliath, but bigger than Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
Well, since Andy got to say that he learned some ecology from me, I'm going to echo and say that one of the joys for me in this project has been listening to Andy articulate theologies of hope that I think are really important. They've certainly made a difference in my life. And I think that the resurrection hope that as a Christian I bring to this is that the story might look like it's over from where I sit, but it's not. The story's never over. And there's this hope that is so much bigger than us that provides the motor to allow us to keep going, whether or not we can see the path forward. And I think that's really important. I think despair is one of that sense of futility is real. It was alive in our students. And it's one of the biggest problems, I think, because the minute we concede, the minute we give into futility, it is actually like that becomes a problem. And so I think that one of the many really important things that Christianity brings to this table is that really unshakable sense of hope that is not, it's not optimism. It's not tethered to this notion that I can predict where this is going. And that keeps us going, whether we can see the path forward clearly or not.
You might say that despair is a positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
And hope is a negative feedback loop theologically. I think that would work pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, actually one of the earliest conversations I had with Andy, I didn't know Andy until she, until she walked into the church, basically. But it was just, we had a series of interesting conversations. But one of the things Andy shared with me was just this poll that she did within her class about who has hope, and the number was very low in her ecological science class. And I'm thinking of, the 19 to 21, 22, whatever, like if they're despairing, that feels like a canary in a coal mine moment. And we should sort of slow things down and take a look at really what's going on. And our second class was called Hope in a Time of Climate Change for a reason.
Yeah.
Because I do think our Christian tradition has a lot to say around hope. And, it has across time in many different crises. We're just right now, the crisis is so big. It's easy to say, what difference does this one thing make that I want to do or not do? And the answer is not that big of a difference, but if a number of people string together those little things, it's not so little anymore, and they all matter. I think that's what I've learned is, I mean, just like every piece of an ecological neighborhood, like every piece of a church neighborhood, every neighbor in it matters fundamentally, and every contribution, therefore, towards the good is going to matter. And we say that right before we collect the offering every Sunday, and I believe that to be true. Everyone can bring something. And that round table that Andy and I sort of thought up and had this as this image of, let's get as many seats around this table as possible, I think is one expression of hope, because I actually do have a lot of hope and shared wisdom. And and we saw that over and over again in class.
Yeah, thinking about the David and Goliath as a frame was super helpful. I just have to say, and I think Andy, you brought it in, and then Andy Lloyd, you threaded it into some of your reflections as you all went along, and it made me think about this little book that I have called Small Acts of Resistance, that are about how tiny things that people do can make a huge difference, if just depending on a lot of the circumstances, and also if other people do them too. And there's this guy who I know in Florida who does this restoration work on a single pond in the middle of St. Petersburg, Florida, and he's been doing it 20 years. And the thing was a dead zone 20 years ago, and now it's teeming with life. People are like walking around it, lunching around it, and I mean, he's got a team of people. They all volunteered, they got together, and then they just started doing it. And they count trash, and they do cleanups, and they invite the neighborhood, and super interesting. They're all scientists who decided to take on this issue in their neighborhood. So that's a tiny little patch of a neighborhood, but it actually has made a massive impact on the quality of life for everybody there, and is like a beacon of what's possible. If we did that, if every little patch of neighborhood did it,
right,
and then you'd have this patchwork, and then you could start connecting the patchwork, together. And I hear that in y'all's work.
Thank you. Yeah, and in those communities where you don't have the human resources, the education, the money, whatever, the bandwidth to get together socially, I think the communities that are in a good position and a strong position in every way also need to be mindful of the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, where it's an ecological disaster, very little water for starters. So I think being mindful of those places in the world that are really struggling is also part of it. It is local. It starts where we live, and it starts taking care of the garden that we are given here, wherever the here is, and to be mindful of those who don't have a garden to draw nutrients from, and food and clean water. So it's both, obviously, but I find that it's easier for folks to understand, I think, many of the concepts in this book by thinking locally and acting in that way that you're describing in St. Pete.
Yeah,
right. And it can't end there. I mean, it's true that the point about global systems not necessarily being as nimble as we would like is fair, and systemic change has to be part of this. And I think I don't think that the frustration on that level needs to be the enemy of making good change where we can make change. And it may just be that systemic change happens through channels other than the usual ones.
It goes up instead of down.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've been working in this field for my whole adult life, and the change that I have seen in the nature of the discourse and in the number of people who are on board with this being a problem, and I mean, it's incredible, and I forget that sometimes, but oh my goodness, we've made progress. We're not there yet, but
yeah. Well, I hate to end this truly, because I've got like a bunch of other questions, but maybe we could put a pause button and talk another time, because I really would love to continue a conversation with y'all. And I want to thank you a lot, not only for being here, but the book really is a wonderful book, and I really want to encourage people to read it and to take it into groups and have some conversations, because you guys cover a lot of ground in these letters back and forth, a scientific ground, theological ground, and ground around friendship and all sorts of, and life, and how all these things fit together. And it's just so, it's really rich. I mean, I so many questions because I just, there's so many layers to what y'all have done. So I want to thank you for, taking on the topic, which I know is not necessarily always a happy topic for everybody. And for the book and the shared search for truth, and beauty in all of this. I want to also thank my library colleagues who have helped make this possible, our IT department, our audience for being with us. Thank you so much for joining us today for this, and thank you for the conversation that you've provided through your questions. Be sure to check out links to purchase the book, Letters from the Ecotone, online, and we wish you happy reading. Book Talks will be back in the coming months to continue our series, and stay tuned for information about that. And have a wonderful night, everyone. Enjoy the springtime and celebrate your neighborhood by getting outside. I highly recommend a good walk after all of this. Thanks again, Andy and Andy. It's great to talk to you both. Yeah. Have a good night.